Hello, welcome back to BIO4YOU. In this video, we're going to discuss Chapter 8, Reproduction and Development. Let's check it out. Okay, so for reproduction and development, alright, so we have four subchapters, 8.1, 8.2, 8.3, and 8.4. 8.1 being types of reproduction, sexual reproduction in flowering plants for 8.2, for 8.3, human reproductive system, and 8.4, we're going to discuss about fertilization. Okay, so here are the learning outcomes for 8.1 and 8.2. You guys can refer to this list of learning outcomes. Okay, so for 8.1, define asexual and sexual reproduction. So first, we're going to discuss about the first keyword or the first terms, which is reproduction. What is reproduction? It is a formation of new individuals from pre-existing cells, i.e. current generation. Okay, it means that for reproduction, we are forming new individuals from a species or from a cell that's already existing, yang memang sudah sedia ada, bukan yang belum tak ada lagi. Okay, the function of reproduction is to ensure the survival of a species. Okay, there are two types of reproduction. The first one is asexual and the second one is sexual. So what is asexual reproduction? It only involves single parent. So it means that there is no male, no female. There is only one gender that can reproduce. For sexual reproduction, it involves both parents, i.e. it involves male and female. So for asexual reproduction, the generations of offspring from a single parent that occurs without the fusion of gametes means that there is no sperm involved, there is no ovum involved, only one single parent. So offspring inherits all chromosomes from one parent, and the offsprings are genetically identical to the parent, means that the offspring is exactly the same as with the parents. No variations, no diversity at all. So sexual reproduction. So sexual reproduction means it's a reproduction arising from fusion of two gametes. It involves male and female gametes, i.e. sperm and ovum. Offspring inherits chromosomes from both parents. Offspring means anak dia, inherits means dia mewarisi chromosomes from both parents. Means that half of the chromosome comes from one parent and the other half of the chromosome comes from the other parent. For example, as human, we have 46 chromosomes. 23 chromosomes comes from our mother, the other 23 chromosomes comes from our father. The offspring are genetically different from the parent. Means anak dia tu dia genetically berbeza daripada parent dia. Macam kita lah, kita tidak exactly sama macam parent kita. Okay, so types of asexual reproduction, there are many of them. So we can start with the binary fission. Okay, so what is binary fission is just as simple as a cell divides into two and they are genetically identical daughter cell. The second one is budding. Budding ni means is form a buds, then dia akan pinch off dan dia akan terpisah. Contohnya seperti yeast, hydra. Regeneration, i.e. some parts of the organism or fragments of the organism can separate and forming new individual. Next is sporulation, i.e. from the production of spore dengan penghasilan spores. Vegetative propagation. Okay, this one such as rhizome like ginger, turmeric. So they can live underground. Okay, so they can form new plant just from their stem. And next one is parthenogenesis. So what is parthenogenesis? A formation of offspring from unfertilized egg or without fertilization of male gamete. Okay, so there are some organisms such as bees, wasps, aphids. They reproduce by producing egg but without being fertilized. Maknanya daripada egg tu terus jadi new individual. So this is what we call as parthenogenesis. So here are the next learning outcome for 8.2. Next, we're going to discuss about sexual reproduction in flowering plants. So flowering plants ni adalah tumbuhan yang berbunga. Okay, so the reproductive organ in angiosperms. What is angiosperms? Angiosperms means tumbuhan yang berbunga. The plants that produce flowers. So actually, the flower is the reproductive organ for plants. For us, human, we have our own reproductive organ, but for plants, it is the flower. So these are the general structures of flower. Alright. So we have the male part, stamen, composed of anther and filament. So this is the anther, and the filament is the stalk that holds the anther. Okay. So then we have the female parts of the plants, which is we call it as carpel. So carpel composed of stigma, and beneath the stigma we have the style, and also, we have ovary that will encapsulate the ovule, that will contain the ovule. And do bear in mind, be reminded that ovule is where the pollen that will later, the final destination for the pollen to reach and fertilize the egg. Egg of the plants reside inside the ovule, dekat dalam ovule. Okay. So flower is attached to the stem by receptacle. Receptacle tu yang warna hijau tapuk dia tu. Complete flower has all four organs. Okay, sepals, petals, carpels. Okay, for sepals and petals, they are non-reproductive organ because sepals and petals ni dia punya kelopak-kelopak tu sahajalah. For carpels is the female reproductive organ part, and stamens is the male reproductive organ. Incomplete flower lack one or more floral organs. So there are two types of plants, monoecious and dioecious. Monoecious plants is a male and female flower on the same plant, whereas for dioecious plant, the male and female flower are on the separate plant. So you may have heard before that there are ini pokok jantan and ini pokok betina. Some plants in the same plant it contains both the male and the female flower. So these are the non-reproductive parts organs in a flower. The petals, the corolla, usually bright in colors, various shapes, and it has scents, means dia ada bau dia, and depends on the pollination. And it is brightly colored to attract pollinators such as bees, wasps, okay, and other organisms. And this was surrounding the stamens. Next is the sepals or calyx. Is the most outer region of the flower, usually green leaf-like structure, and enclose. The function is to enclose and protect floral bud before it opens. Ni ada punya tapuk dia tu lah, the one that is green in color. This is sepals. Okay. Next, male reproductive organ in flower. We're going to look into a bit detail of the stamen. Stamen consists of a long stalk, the filament. Okay, and a terminal called the anther. Usually it contains 4 pollen sacs. Okay, so inside this anther it usually contains 4 pollen sacs. Pollen sac will produce pollen grain. So we know inside this anther we have the pollen sacs which will produce the pollen grain. The female reproductive organ in flower, okay, carpel, consists of ovary, style, and stigma. So inside ovary where you find the ovule. Top of style is a sticky structure called stigma. Why it need to be sticky? Because it need to catch it serves as the landing platform for pollens. Means the flying pollen need to be catched. Hence, that's why the stigma is a sticky structure. At the base of the carpel, so it's an ovary, a swollen structure containing one or more ovule. Okay. So development of male gametophyte. So male gametophyte is the male part of the plant. Occur within anther. So this is the anther. So this is inside the enter. So we can see here the label pollen. Okay, so pollen sacs 1, 2, 3, 4. That's what I mentioned earlier. So we have 4 pollen sacs for each enter usually. Okay, so pollen sacs also called as microsporangia. So one anther has 4 microsporangia. It has 4 pollen sacs. Each microsporangium contain microsporocytes. So microsporangia and microsporangium ni cuma is the same thing, but it's only plural or singular. So this one is plural, dipanggil sebagai microsporangia. If it is just one, nak sebut satu, singular, which is microsporangium. It contain microsporocytes or we call as microspore mother cells 2N. Okay, so now we're going to discuss about development of male gametophyte. So basically kita nak bincang lah macam mana terhasilnya ataupun terjadinya male gametophyte ni. So but what is male gametophyte? So basically we want to produce the pollen grain. Okay. So because we know for the male part of the plant, okay, so it will produce the pollen, and for the female part of the plant, it will produce the egg. So each microsporocyte, okay, divide by meiosis to produce 4 haploid microspores. So we have here microspore mother cell, or also known as the microsporocyte. So it will divide by meiosis to produce 4 haploid microspores here. Each microspores once divide by mitosis and produce 2 nucleus. Okay, so after that, this microspore, they will produce each of the cell will produce 2 nucleus inside the cell. One of the nucleus is called as generative nucleus. The other nucleus is called as tube nucleus. The tube nucleated structure is called as pollen grain. Now, jadilah these are the pollen grains. There are 4 pollen grains. So inside this pollen grain, so we have the generative nucleus, and the other one is pollen tube nucleus, or short form there is tube nucleus. So the continuation for development of male gametophyte. Okay, so actually this is how the pollen grain looks like. So we know by now inside this pollen grain, we would expect to see there are 2 types of nucleus. The first one is generative nucleus, and the other one is pollen tube nucleus inside this mature pollen grain. So pollen grain is enclosed by 2 walls, thick outer wall, exine, and thin inner wall, intine. So these 2 names are actually extra information only. Okay, so pollen grain is known as immature young male gametophyte. So it's a sperm producing structure. A pollen grain becomes mature only when it lands on compatible stigma. So remember that even though we have said mature pollen grain, so why we say mature pollen grain? Mature pollen grain because the grain has developed into 2 nucleus, but it is still yet immature in terms of male gametophyte. Maksudnya kita panggil mature pollen grain sebab pollen grain ni sudah matang dari segi hanya ada 2 nukleus. However, dia ni sebagai male gametophyte belum matang lagi. Dia akan jadi male gametophyte yang matang hanya setelah bila dia lands on stigma, okay, and later it will develop into a further structure. Okay, so development of male gametophyte continue after pollination. We will see on the next following slides. So here, when pollen grain lands on stigma, the tube nucleus will produce pollen tube. Okay, and the generative nucleus will divide once by mitosis to produce 2 sperm nuclei, i.e. 2 male gametes. These are the structure that I want to mention earlier. So by having the process of pollination ni maksudnya pendebungaan. Okay, so only then the pollen grain becomes mature in terms of mature gametophyte, because now they can produce 2 sperms. So these 2 sperms are the 2 male gametes. Germinated pollen grain is known as now a mature male gametophyte. Pollen tube will deliver sperms to the egg. So what is pollen tube? Is this structure that keeps on developing, that will keeps on growing until it reach the embryo sac. So we can see here the process of this pollination, where we have the pollen. There's a small tiny dots here on top of this stigma. Once it's land, then it will develop this pollen tube, this orange like a tunnel, like terowong ni, is what we call as the pollen tube. So inside this tunnel, or inside this what we call as pollen tube, where we have the tube nucleus and two sperm cells traveling down until it reach the embryo sac. So this microsporocyte, okay, after meiosis, it will form the four haploid spores. Okay, so then it will form the pollen grain. So from the pollen grain, it will have the generative nucleus, and it will also have the tube nucleus. The tube nucleus will produce the pollen tube, i.e., this hollow structure, and the generative nucleus will undergo mitosis to form two sperm cells. So these are actually a summary of what happens in terms of the development of male gametophyte. So this is the gametophyte generation. Now we move on into the development of female gametophyte. Okay, so there are a lot of things that are going to be discussed here. Alright, so we will break down it one by one. Okay, we will look at the first one. Female gametophyte develops within ovule. So where we can find this ovule? Okay, inside this structure. Okay, so inside this structure, which is the ovary, inside the ovary, where we can see, where we can find the ovules. Yes, in one ovary, it may contain more than one ovule. Okay, so we have many ovule here. So inside the ovule, inside of one of these spherical structure here is this one. Okay, so inside this ovule, where we have the development of the female gametophyte. So each ovule is attached to the ovary wall at the site called placenta by a short stalk called funicle. So this is the funicle, short stalk, tangkai yang pendek. So dia akan melekat dekat situ lah. Okay. Each ovule has one megaspore. Megaspore mother cell, or also called as megasporocyte. In this diagram is referring to this one, megasporocyte. This big structure here, this one big cell here. Each megasporocyte will divide by meiosis to produce 4 haploid megaspores. So 1, 2, 3, 4. So there are 4 haploid megaspores. But then the 3 megaspores near the micropyle will degenerate. What is micropyle? Is this opening. Bukan dekat sini ni, dekat dalam ovule ni kita panggil sebagai micropyle. So out of these 4, all of these 4, only one will survive. The other 3 will degenerate, means akan self-destroy. Dia akan musnah dengan sendirinya. Okay, so then what will happen is that this one surviving megaspore, okay, so the surviving megaspore will undergo mitosis 3 times, okay, to produce 8 haploid cell. Okay, forming the embryo sac. So how come 3 times of meiosis produce 8 haploid cell? Okay, so this is very logic. So the first mitosis from 1 cell, now you become 2. Okay, we have 2. So the second mitosis, each of this one will become 2. So after the third meiosis, each of this will become 2, this will become 2, and in total, after 3 mitosis, you will have 8 cells. Okay, so those 8 cells, they are divided into several types. The first one, there are 3 cells will become the 3 antipodal nuclei. So daripada 8 sel itu, 3 akan jadi 3 antipodal nuclei, and there are 2 will become 2 polar nuclei. Okay, and the other 3, 2 will become synergids, and only 1 will become the ovum. Okay, so but what is the most important cell here is the ovum. This is the egg, okay, for the female gametophyte. So, alright, this is a simplified diagram of how from one cell becomes eight. Okay, remaining. So all of these statements here is just re-emphasizing what I've mentioned earlier. The remaining megaspore undergo mitosis three times to produce 8 haploid nuclei. Remember, each of the nucleus, or if it is, each of the cells just now is a haploid. Okay, this cell is now known as embryo sac, aka female gametophyte. The 4 nuclei is found near the micropyle, and another 4 is at the opposite pole. One nucleus at each pole moves to the center of embryo sac, and both nuclei is now called as a polar nuclei. Okay, the 2 nuclei at the center is called as polar nuclei. Here, these 2 nuclei at the center is called as polar nuclei. The 3 nuclei at the opposite end to the micropyle within embryo sac is called antipodals. So these are the 3 antipodals because it is stated that the opposite end to the micropyle. So this is the micropyle end. Okay, micropyle within the embryo sac. Okay, there is one opening. Main dekat embryo sac ni ada macam pintu, macam tempat yang terbuka. This what we call as micropyle. So and this why is called as micropylar end. The 3 nuclei at the micropyle consists of ovum, the one in the middle, which is the egg cell, and flanked by 2 synergids. Maksudnya diapit oleh 2 synergid cell. Okay, the synergids will attract and guide the pollen tube. So means that function of synergid cell ni dia akan menarik ataupun attract the growth of the pollen tube yang keep on growing tu tadi untuk pergi sampai ke sini. For the antipodal cells, until now it is still for the function is still unknown. Okay, still unclear what are the direct functions of these 3 antipodal cells. And the polar nuclei will give rise to the endosperm tissue. This one, the polar nuclei will become the endosperm tissue. Later, we're going to discuss what is endosperm tissue and what is the function of this endosperm tissue in the seed, dalam biji benih. So here is the quick summary of development of the female gametophyte. First, we have the 1 megasporocyte. After meiosis, it will produce 4 megaspores. Out of all those 4 megaspores, only one that will survive. The other 3 will degenerate. Okay, and that 1 megaspore that survive will undergo mitosis 3 times, producing 8 haploid nuclei in embryo sac, mana kat dalam embryo sac. From that 8 haploid nuclei, 3 of them will become 3 antipodal nuclei, 2 become 2 polar nuclei, and the other 3, one of it become ovum, and the other 2 become the synergid cell or the synergid nuclei. So this diagram gives you a summary from side by side for the male part development and the female part development. This one for the male part, how does it produce the pollen grain, and for the female part, how can it reach to become and how it reach to produce egg. So that's what is most important. So then we're going to look at double fertilization. I'm pretty sure you have heard these terms, this term during your secondary school, during your SPM study. So what does it mean of double fertilization? So it is a mechanism of fertilization in angiosperms dalam tumbuhan berbunga in which 2 sperm cells unite, okay, with 2 cells in the female gametophyte inside the embryo sac to form the zygote and endosperm. Okay, so okay, we will look into the next slide with a better diagram. Okay, so during pollination, pollen grain is transferred from the anther to a stigma of a plant. Outer wall of pollen, the exine, will secrete a chemical substance to determine the compatibility. Mana nak check sama ada dia ngam ataupun tak ngam. Okay, so if the pollen is compatible, the inner wall in tin will secrete a chemical substance to digest the stigma tissue. Maknanya kalau ngam dia akan buat this pollen tube. Okay, the pollen will germinate when the tube cell produce pollen tube. Okay, the germinated pollen consists of pollen tube, tube nucleus, and generative nucleus. Now, still is called as immature male gametophyte. The development of young microgametophyte occurs within the carpel, which then will supply the nutrition and protection to the young male gametophyte. Okay, the pollen tube will elongate down the style towards the embryo sac. Just for your information, these two points is not really important. It's only extra information for you. But this third point is important. Where you need to understand the pollen tube elongates. So this pollen tube will elongate, it will keeps on growing until it reach the micropyle opening of the embryo sac. Okay, so see here, this is a tube cell will keeps on growing until it reach the micropyle. Okay, the pollen tube elongates down the style towards the embryo sac. As it grows, the generative cell will divide by mitosis to form two sperm nuclei. So here are the two sperm nuclei. The male gametophyte is matured and now consists of two sperm nuclei, tube cell, and pollen tube. Okay, this sentence is trying to tell you that now the male gametophyte has become matured once dia dah ada two sperm nuclei, dia ada tube cell, and a pollen tube. Okay, so now we look at the process of this double fertilization. Okay, the tip of the pollen tube will enter the ovule through the micropyle. So this is what it meant. Tip, hujung dia. Hujung of pollen tube ni akan masuk dekat ovule melalui micropyle. The tube nucleus will later degenerate. Yang tube nucleus tu kan ada dekat depan tu kan. Seperti ada satu nucleus dekat depan tu. Yang that will, the function of that tube nucleus is the one that will produce this pollen tube. Okay, so then the tip of the pollen tube will burst. The tube nucleus just now degenerates, dia akan musnah dengan sendirinya. The tip of the pollen tube will burst. Okay, two sperm cells are released into embryo sac. So from here we have one of the sperm will fuse with the egg cell. So one of the sperm will fuse with the egg cell, forming the zygote, 2N. So because this ovum is haploid and also this male gametophyte or this sperm also N. So N campur N jadilah 2N. And the other sperm, another sperm will fuse with two polar nuclei. These two polar nuclei to form a triploid endosperm. What is triploid endosperm? 3N, 3N. Kenapa 3N? Because you have 2 plus you have 2N plus more 1N. So in total you have 3N. This will later develop into endosperm. So the fusion of two sperms with different nuclei in embryo sac is why it is called as double fertilization. After double fertilization, we have the egg plus with sperm. Egg which is haploid plus sperm which is haploid, it will become the zygote 2N. This one will develop into embryo. Okay, after embryo, then will become the organism. Okay, the two polar nuclei which is 2N becomes fertilized with sperm. This one will become endosperm with 3N. Okay, and then we have the integument will become the seed coat or testa. This is also 2N. Ovules will develop into seeds and ovary will develop into fruit. Okay, so I hope you guys still can recall that inside ovary where we have many ovules inside it. Okay, so that ovules will later become seed. So the ovary itself will later becomes into a fruit. So technically speaking, what you are eating, for example, if you're imagining an apple, you're eating an apple. So technically, you are eating a developed ovary. So once let's say you cut apple into half, then you can see there are two. I mean, there are you can see the seeds. There are two of them. Sometimes there are four of them. So the seeds comes from the ovules. Okay. So zygote will give rise to an embryo. Okay. So endosperm acts as a food storing tissue of the seed. This one is to ensure endosperm develop only in ovules where egg has been fertilized. Okay, maksud dia macam ni. Just now, where we can find this endosperm is actually inside the seed. So contohnya, for example, this kernel here, the part where we have the zygote becomes to an embryo is only this part here. The rest of the part ataupun isi of the seed itu, that is the endosperm. For example of this peanut, okay, the part that I'm pointing now is the zygote that will later develop into embryo and etc. So this whole part here, selebihnya ni, semua ni adalah endosperm. Okay. So for this diagram, it shows you the angiosperm life cycle. Angiosperm is the tumbuhan berbunga. So we can see, okay, we can start from this part over here. We have the male part keeps on developing, okay, and then we have the female part develops until it matures, and after fertilization, we have the pollen. After the pollination, not fertilization, we have the pollen tube developing, okay, until, and we have the egg cell here inside the ovule. So this whole structure is what I called earlier is the ovary. So this is the ovule. In this diagram, it only show one ovule. Actually, there are many other ovules, okay. Until the process of double fertilization, where we have one of the sperm fertilize the egg, the other sperm will fertilize the polar nuclei. Okay, so then this ovule will later become the seed. So this is the young embryo that will later turns into the plant, and the endosperm is this structure here. So the function of endosperm to supply nutrients for the developing embryo, and this green structure here is originally the ovary. So if I turn a little bit back over here, so here is the ovary that later will turn to become the fruit, the fleshy fruit, the part of the apple, for example, that you are eating. So this ovule here, this minuscule ovule here, will become the seeds. Okay, so you need to try to imagine yourself. Okay, so that will be all for this first part of the video. Okay, as usual, please subscribe, like this video, and share it with your friends. Okay, until now, thank you, and see you in the next video. Alright.